Alejandro Glencoe might represent not only cattlemen, but also Uruguayans, and also humanity's great forerunners, and also men with red beards, and also those who are seated in armchairs. Nora Airfjord was Norwegian. Would she represent secretaries, Norwegian womanhood, or more obviously, all beautiful women? Would a single engineer be enough to represent all engineers, including those of New Zealand? Hi everyone, I'm Kyla Chasalow, and I'm here to present to you some work I've done with Karen Levy over the past year, exploring the concept of representativeness, its history, its ambiguities, and its relevance for FAccT. So, if, as Borges tells us, it's impossible to be representative in every way, then it follows that everything is unrepresentative in some way. And the question becomes, representative or unrepresentative in what way? And that turns out to be a complicated question. First, because representative has multiple meanings. So for example, if I say something is representative, and what I mean is that it is typical, that's quite different from saying something is representative because it covers a lot of variety, which is again different from saying it is representative because it gives accurate information. And second, as the planners of Borges' story discovered, representativeness involves choices. Choices of what variables matter, choices of the target. Representative of what? Representativeness is what some call a suitcase word, a word that packs in many meanings and has intuitive appeal. There's often something statistical about it, yet it's not a strictly defined statistical term. And although that's frustrating, we also can't quite do without it. We couldn't get rid of it even if we wanted to. We can't force it to just have one definition. And it's used all over, in newspapers, in statistics, in methodological discussions across the sciences, in politics, and in machine learning and the FACT community today. Now, in our paper, we explore representativeness historically and in the present, in part as a way to think about how to approach such suitcase words in a useful way, a way that improves communication, but also allows these words to contribute to our understanding, despite their ambiguities. Now, for us, this meant meeting the word alive. And what I mean by that is that we're looking not just for a definition, but to understand how the word is used in multiple ways in practice, how it has been mobilized, and what values or ideals it communicates or confronts. Now, in the paper, we do this in a few main arcs. First, we take a more epistemic focus. We look at the history of representative sampling in statistics, and we then broaden to its other uses in science. After that, we use historical examples to develop 4 normative tensions surrounding the word. And then we consider how this all connects to concerns in the FACT community. So I'm now going to preview the first 3 and begin to weave in the 4th as we go. So the statistical roots of representativeness. Formal sampling, or as some originally called it, the representative method, is surprisingly recent, a product of the early 20th century. Now, some historians have asked why then, and argued that it has to do with a variety of socio-political and economic changes. So, for example, in the US, the Great Depression led to a more interventionist government, with a need for rapidly available national-level information. Expanding consumer markets and national election campaigns also created demand for representative social data. And in that way, representativeness and the representative method didn't just pop into the minds of statisticians. It was a socio-political problem translated into new ways of doing statistics. Now, in the paper, we do spend quite a bit of time tracing the minds of statisticians as they debated whether and how to sample. We use this to uncover a range of statistical meanings that we can roughly place on a spectrum from narrow to more flexible. On one end, representativeness reflects a seemingly simple ideal, a proportionate match, a miniature. It has also been common to use it to mean random sampling, proportionate, but only on average. Moving farther, it sometimes means any data designed or collected in a way that allows accurate estimation, like when we oversample smaller groups to attain better group-level accuracy. We could then have a sample that's disproportionate, but capable of yielding representative information. And finally, most broadly, representativeness is used to discuss fundamental concerns tied to generalizability and inference. Can these data or results tell me about some larger thing I have in mind? Now, when we looked at representativeness in science more broadly, we also found that the word gets applied not only to individual data sets, but also across collections of studies, data sets, and subjects. Sometimes this is described in terms of the model organism problem, where fields of research come to rely on particular research objects, shaping the field's direction and findings, and perhaps to the exclusion of others. We should also note here that representativeness isn't some self-evident good. Its desirability has been contested in scientific research, including in qualitative research and epidemiology. I think some of that debate stems from this range of meanings I just described. Does the word strictly mean probability sampling, or is it some more flexible term for generalizability? In practice, it's both. So, to jump ahead in time for a moment, how is this relevant for FAccT so far? Well, it certainly indicates a need for caution in when we call data representative. In the FACT literature, representativeness is sometimes mixed in with phrases like fair representation and representation bias. But representation bias can mean at least two things. It could mean that sampled data are disproportionate on relevant variables relative to some target population. It could also mean a class imbalance problem, where model performance may be worse on groups that make up a smaller proportion of the training data. A well-known example of this is Bulamwini and Gabru's work on face recognition. Now, importantly, this can happen even when data are proportionate to some target population. And that means representative data, in the sense of a proportionate match, could lead to unfair representation. But then, further complicating matters is that some do use representative to refer to forms of equal representation. And so it becomes important to be precise about what we mean. Now we can also move up to that model organism level. In recent years, there's been discussion about the data sets that machine learning research tends to rely on for benchmarking, and whether they can stand in for other kinds of data and tasks. And we can ask similar questions about fairness, accountability, and transparency research. Does FACT have model organisms? How do they shape the field? I think we see one strain of this thinking in Barabbas and co-authors' paper from last year's conference, where they call on us to study up, to examine the powerful, scrutinizing judges, for example, rather than only trying to predict and evaluate the behavior of the accused. Now, this isn't just about one data set, and there isn't a clear total population of problems or perspectives to sample from. Yet there is a concern with over and under representation that happens through the data sets and problems and perspectives we do or don't tend to focus on. So we begin to see in these two examples both how questions about what it means to be representative can interact with debates about fairness, and how the concept can be useful for asking critical questions, including in our own field. Now, in the next part of our paper, we turn to more towards normative difficulties of the concept, and we show they extend beyond the consequences of mixing up different meanings. We identify four main normative tensions or themes surrounding the concept. First, we have the likeness ideal. In both statistics and politics, representativeness can be situated within the umbrella of representation by its basic focus on descriptive likeness, the miniature, the match. But in both statistics and politics, that value for likeness confronts other values and logics. Second, we have what we call exclusionary representativeness. Representativeness often has these connotations of inclusion, equity, participation, coverage. But as we noted earlier, claims of representativeness reflect choices about which people and variables are relevant, or what to represent in the first place. And those choices can be exclusionary. Now, third, representativeness has rhetorical authority, merited or not. It often sounds like a good thing, and that sometimes means that it can mislead or distract. And fourth, representativeness is time and place specific, but importantly, it raises not just empirical questions about whether the past can stand for the present, but about whether the past or the present should stand for the future. Does what we have now reflect what we'd like to see. So in the paper, we provide historical cases to illustrate each of these, but I'm going to focus here on just the first two. So going back to this idea of likeness, representativeness is often used to suggest some value for a part being like the whole. And as we discuss in the paper, this can have a variety of motivations, normative and epistemic. But as we also point out, that value for likeness confronts other values in logic. And in the paper, we draw on a case from Emmanuel Didier's book, America by Numbers, which illustrates this point. So, in the mid-19th century, American farmers had a problem. Accurate statistics about crop yields were hard to come by, and that made farmers vulnerable to speculators spreading false information. In the 1860s, the US Department of Agriculture began to collect and distribute some of those statistics, and it did so via crop reporting. Now, this meant forming a network of volunteers who were selected not to be like other farmers, but to be unlike them. They wanted people with exceptional discernment and a public-spirited willingness to report on crop yields for entire neighborhoods. Now, this method was used for a while, but in the 1920s, and especially with the Great Depression, it broke down and was replaced in time with probability sampling, in which farmers reported only on their own farms. They became examples, not spokespeople, and their representativeness began to matter. Now, at the same time, the focus of data collection shifted a bit, more towards government planning. And as Didier writes, representativity had replaced participation. Now, this case illustrates a number of related tensions around representativeness. Crop reporting had that democratic appeal of voluntary participation. Yet, instead of likeness, it focused on knowledge and skill. Sampling had no voluntary participation, but it did thereby target likeness, a purposeful, structured inclusion. And the caveat for both of these, though, is that inclusion didn't necessarily mean that farmers had any power over how data were collected or used. And in fact, we see some similar tensions today. So for example, around crowdsourcing and in calls for participatory machine learning and algorithm design. When is it okay for participants or data collectors to be exceptional rather than like the broader group of people that data or technology might impact? Or better put, for which variables and situations do we care about likeness? And for which might we use other criteria? And why? And that brings me towards my next point, the possibility for exclusionary representativeness. So, a historical case that illustrates this in a stark way is the famous study Middletown by Robert and Helen Lind. Middletown was published in 1929 as an anthropological study of the city of Muncie, Indiana. It was presented as a novel attempt to turn the objective scientific gaze to the everyday lives of Americans. And to the author's surprise, became a major public sensation. Now, the Linds were a bit inconsistent about whether they meant this study to be a so-called study of a representative American town. But the name Middletown certainly suggests some sense of the ordinary and average, and they wrote in the introduction that one factor in their selection was that the city be as representative as possible of contemporary American life. But here's the catch. A page later, they recognized that Muncie is also unusually homogeneous for an industrial city, with few immigrants and few Black people. In fact, the Linds also excluded the Black people that did live in Muncie from their results, something made particularly stark when they note this exclusion in a caption underneath the table reporting high schoolers' answers to a question on white supremacy. Now, so we might immediately conclude here, okay, Middletown was not even representative of Muncie alone, let alone the whole US. But we should also ask in what way the Linds and much of the public hype around the study could suggest it to be representative. And Sarah Ego has argued that the concept of representativeness at work here was less empirical than normative, shaped by an ideal of a white Protestant America. It's not only that it was called representative, but really it wasn't, is that the whole framework in which representativeness was considered was built on judgments of who belonged to the so-called typical America. Now, this concept of typicality is a particularly problematic flavor of representativeness, and I can't do it full justice here. We use it all the time, like when we talk about typical examples, average types, or a person embodying the needs or views of a large group of people. And I'm not saying that mode of thinking is entirely wrong, but I do want to make the point that typicality de-emphasizes variety. In a sense, the typical is unrepresentative, or at least representative in a particularly exclusionary way. And as Middletown illustrates, condensing variety into the typical involves judgments about who can represent and who counts as part of the whole to be represented. And those judgments tend to reflect people's experiences, views, desires, and prejudices. So I've now given you some taste of the first three main sections of the paper. And in the last section of our paper, we look at where the concept arises in FACT and machine learning and what kinds of tensions and questions it generates there. We organize them under four broad headings: data, shift, participation, and power. Now first, as we said earlier, when we speak of representative data, we need to be careful. In the literature, we find representative being used to mean many things: proportionate samples, balanced samples, data summarization, the real-world applicability of a system, and more. When not made precise, the word can appear to promise more than it does, or simply mislead. Now second, representativeness is also embedded in conversations about shift. We find people using the concept and related language to critique systems applied across contexts or over time, or both. Those discussions raise empirical questions, but also normative ones. Not just, is it representative now, but does it represent what we would like to see? Third, as we mentioned earlier, the concept of representativeness raises key questions for discussions of participatory processes, including questions about why we value participation, how we choose our target population, and what it means for people or groups to be included or represented. And finally, we emphasize that representative data are not always ethical data. Inclusion and coverage do not always empower those represented. And as I said earlier, achieving or evaluating representativeness involves choices. The power lens encourages us to ask, whose choices? Whose aspirations? It also means we need to be careful with this word from a rhetorical standpoint. The word itself has power, but sometimes power to obscure. So, to summarize, representativeness is a seemingly intuitive, widespread concept with no one definition. It has a long history, and it's been contested in statistics, science, and politics, with both epistemic and normative implications at stake. I think we've shown here that it can also be quite generative, but also misleading. And that's why it's important to ask questions like, representative in what way? Achieved how? At what time? For whom? And the thing is, to do that, we're going to need a lot of other words, including lots of other suitcase words. And if that's frustrating, I can only say that we can't do otherwise, and that we also gain something from exploring and going out to meet these words alive. Thank you.